There are a lot of examples of beautiful games out there. Hollow Knight, Ori, Tales of Iron. These are games that I often use as examples on how to make great game art. But one consistent issue with these games, and a lot with the scenes that I make on this channel, is that this isn't a realistic example of what a solo developer can make. These are not solo projects. And even if they were, this type of art can only be done quickly if you're an experienced artist. So I thought I'd talk about how you can get fairly nice looking results with little effort. So we're going to be making scenes like these. They aren't amazing, but unlike Tales of Iron, which has 20 assets that look incredible, a scene like this mostly relies on having one decent looking sprite, an auto tile texture that you can just quickly spam across the scene, that even on its own looks fairly okay. I've released all of these tile textures, along with 2 guide textures for free on my Patreon, so that if you want you can download it after watching this video. But first I want to explain a bit. You might think that the game art that I'm most impressed by is art like Cuphead or Gris. But the truth is that the game that probably impresses me the most is Islets. This is a cute game, and it looks really nice. People buy this game because of its aesthetic and polish. But take a second and look at how it achieves this. It's just a grassy tile map, and a background with some leaf sprites and a sky. This result is achieved with almost no sprites. It's efficient art. Efficient isn't necessarily the praise you want to hear when someone describes your art, but I think it's important to understand just how great this is. If we look at a game like Candle, this looks great, but every single asset in a scene like this is unique, which means an artist had to sit and paint every single brushstroke that you see. Now if you're an artist, you'll probably love doing this. It's kind of like painting a painting. But if you're a beginner, this is an immense amount of creative labor. 40 assets mean you have to not only imagine what 40 assets to make, but you also have to understand how to make 40 assets look good. On top of that, you have to have the knowledge on how to put 40 assets together without creating a mess. Imagine if you instead have one asset like this one. Now you only have to think about how to make one single asset look good. And since you only have one asset, you can almost accidentally make a nice looking tile, and you don't have to think about how it goes together with other assets, because you only have one asset. Making an asset like this is just such a good springboard for your project, because it looks okay even on its own. So let's get into more specifically how this works, and how to make a decent looking tile. So I want us to look at what happens visually when we have one tile repeated. If we take a tile like this, it looks like a fairly nice looking stone block. But if I repeat this, we kind of stop seeing it as a stone block. Now it looks kind of artificial. This stone block creates this repetitive pattern that looks kind of cheap, and I will argue it looks bad. So we need more than one tile. But even if we add more than one tile, we still have to be careful with how it looks when repeated. If we take a tile like this, kind of rock with some moss on it, and then we create a few versions of it, we can see that when we throw it together, it looks less like a rocky moss tile, and more like I tried making a camouflage pattern. So what happens if we just make lots of different tiles, and throw it all together in a random order? Well, now it doesn't look artificial, and it stops looking like a pattern, but it looks kind of messy. There's a lot of stuff that happens here visually. Even though each individual asset looks kind of nice, together it looks a bit visually crowded. Now you can handle this so that it still looks fairly decent. Spelunky and SteamWorld Dig are examples of games that have this kind of somewhat visually crowded tile map, but still look nice. But I will say that this is more effort and is likely to look bad if you aren't careful. So if you want to make a nice looking tile set, I think the best way to do it is either you fade it out so that the edges of the tile map are light but the interior kind of dark. Or you go for a simple texture that is unobtrusive and add a few random elements here and there. We can see this unobtrusive method in Broforce. This is kind of messy, but when we get these big tile chunks, this area becomes significantly simpler than the rest. But a better example of this simple texture is Adventure Pals. This looks nice and cohesive, but the tile itself is almost empty. And we can even see this idea of a simple tile working quite well in Kyle Thompson's first game, Sheepo, where the tile set is just basically a silhouette. And most of the aesthetics relies on the background. It's even simpler to make, but still fairly cute. Kyle Thompson's second game, Islets, which I read about in the beginning, showcases a mix of this, where sometimes it fades out, and sometimes we get a simple grass texture. What I'm basically saying here is that if we want a nice tile set, we want an edge tile that is visually interesting, but an interior tile that is boring and relatively empty. This way we avoid creating a pattern, and we avoid creating a cluttered looking game. So in my opinion, a nice tile generally follows this principle, where if it's just a single tile, the edges of the tile are sort of lighter and interesting, but the center of the tile is dark and less interesting. And if this tile becomes a bigger chunk, now we might have to add an even darker and less interesting center. And if we just fill the scene with our tile pattern, what we should have is generally this idea, where only the edges are contrasty and light, but the interiors demand less attention. Now there is an interesting discussion to be had about whether the bottom of the tile should be light or in shadow, but we can get to that later. For now I want to focus on this idea that we only need to light up the edges of our tile. This tile that I created here is just a reference tile. I only made this in order to showcase where we should place our contrast. This tile is not meant to look nice, and it's not representing anything. In fact, I made this by using the Mark and Fill tool following a grid in Affinity, so I didn't even draw. But take a look at what happens when I add an outline to this reference texture. I add some line art in a somewhat nice brick pattern, and some scribbles, and then I change the color bit. And now when I spam this across the scene, well, it's a fairly nice tile map. You might see a tile like this and think, oh, it looks good because this dude can draw. But I barely drew this. First of all, I just followed this principle and drew line art on top of this reference tile. And second of all, I only drew one tile. What do I mean by this? It's obviously 47 tiles in a big texture like this. Well, yeah, kind of. In practice, I do have to fill 47 tiles in order to draw a tile set like this. But it's not 47 tiles of creative labor. I don't have to imagine how I should draw every single tile. I'm actually drawing one tile, looking at the pattern it creates, and then just copying how I made that tile. In practice, this actually means literally copying. And then I went in and started fixing anything that didn't line up. Whenever there's a white tile, I make a block every few pixels. Whenever there's a light gray tile, I make a slightly bigger line. I might think a bit when I make the first tile. But when I'm drawing my 10th tile, it's not like I have to imagine how my white tile should look. It obviously has to look kind of the same as when I made it 10 times before. Now personally, I hate doing this, because it's just menial labor. You don't have to think, you just have to repeat what you've already done. But for an inexperienced artist, this is actually a good thing. You only have to accidentally make one nice looking tile, and then copy yourself. Now, why do I have 47 tiles? Well, with 47 tiles, you have enough unique tiles to make your tile map look sensible. If I place one tile, it ought to look like this. This looks sensible. This, however, would not look sensible. If I had two tiles, now it can't look like this. This looks bad and not quite sensible. Now we want the middle to connect, like this. Now if we make 4 tiles stacked, it should look like this, not this. All of this means that since each of these tiles in a scenario like this is unique, we kind of need all of these unique tiles. And if we exhaust most cases we can create, we kind of need 47 tiles. Now this texture specifically is called an autotile texture. It's basically just a texture that I plug into my software, be it Unity, Tile or Godot, and then I tell Godot, if this tile is next to another tile below, but nothing on the other sides, just use this tile. And if the tile is completely surrounded, use this tile. This sounds complex, but most of you have probably seen this. If you haven't, there are a lot of tutorials on how to use these in Godot, Tile or Unity. And you can make more advanced rule sets than this. Now in a way, it sounds simple to just make 47 similar tiles. But I kinda glossed over a small thing that actually makes tiles fairly annoying. The tiles actually need to line up with each other. What do I mean by this? Well, if we look at this scenario, we can see that this tile and this tile are identical. But they don't connect to the same tile. These two tiles are different. So suppose I add a texture to these tiles. Now they look seamless in this scenario, but this tile no longer matches perfectly with this tile. So we can start to see how making tile textures can get annoying. They need to actually match several tiles at once. Now if you want to have fairly advanced textures, like the ones you can see in Splunky, you can fix this without too much work. It's a bit of a hassle, but it is manageable. Cartoon Coffee has a short video on how you can do this. But if you don't have a complex textures and very little shading, like you can see here, you can actually get a seamless tile match fairly easily. If we look at this reference texture, an overlay where each and every tile ends, we can see that the tiles specifically only need to match here, 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 and here. So if we look at my simple grass tile, we can see that I play around with the line and make it kind of random when we are dealing with the insides of the tile. But at the edge of the tile, I make sure to have it line up exactly at this point. This is the second reason I like using a reference tile. It does make it easy to keep track of where you want your focus to be, but it also helps you line up your tiles. Now if you're doing pixel art, this lineup thing isn't that big of an issue, because you're dealing with fairly few pixels. But in a scenario like this where we have 128 by 128 tiles, we need to make sure that it lines up. The more shading and more textures you add, the more likely it is that you have to use other methods to have them line up. Either the seamless texture method, or by actually taking your first tile and use it as a reference for every single tile you connect it to. But if you go for a simple style like this, or pixel art, you just have to make sure that it connects at a few points. And that's not too difficult. Now you might start to get the sense that this is a bit annoying, and doesn't at all seem like low effort. And yes, I hate making tile textures, which is kind of why I don't talk about them. It's a hassle, you have to go back and forth between your engine and your drawing software, but you have to understand that this auto tile texture took 4 hours to make. And I could probably make it somewhat production ready in another 2 hours. This auto tile texture took 3 hours. And this brick texture actually only took 2 hours. Weirdly enough, the one I liked the least took the longest time. But all of them are fairly quick to make. Now in terms of drawing a single asset, 2 hours is a lot. But in terms of having a decent looking base tile for an entire biome, 2 hours is almost no time at all. Because of how well an asset like this scales, I'd argue it's almost worth spending 20 to 30 hours on a tile like this. For a game like Islets, the characters and the tile kind of sell that game. If you make 6 of these type of tiles, you have the base assets for a lot of environments in your game kind of covered. So it's worth spending more time on it. But as I said, even though I complain a lot and it seems complex, these tiles don't take 30 hours to make. But so far, we have actually just covered how to make this tile. And it's a fairly boring tile. And sure, if we throw a background behind this, it looks nice. But this type of tile is one of the reasons I hate tile maps the most. I personally legitimately hate completely square tiles. They look artificial. I want my sprite texture to cover the feet and to have sort of rounded edges. And this brick texture is completely square. But we can see with this grass texture, it actually does cover the feet. You can actually use tiles without making them square. And the basics of it are fairly similar. I made a reference texture for these as well. This is still a 128 by 128 tile, but instead of drawing right up to the edge, I'm leaving a bit of space at the edges. In this scenario, when I add my collider, it's going to be placed here, which is 32 pixels inside each tile. And then this white part is going to be used to make the tile seem more rounded and to cover the feet. If we have a gray box scene like this white part would extend just a little bit beyond the collider like this. It's a small difference, but we can see that it covers the feet and can help you soften the edges, like this. The reference tile looks and functions fairly similar to the fully covered tile. But now, since we have the space to draw outside the collider, we can more easily create somewhat fancy tiles, like this blue rock tile, or this grass tile. The collider here is only 64 pixels instead of 128, so it will affect your game design somewhat, but in my opinion, it does look significantly better. Now you might be noticing that these tiles are significantly more complex than the simple brick tile I went over in the beginning. And yes, they are more complex. And as I said, they take slightly longer to make. But they still follow this base principle that we can see in the reference tile. It's still just 5 layers. The highlight, which has somewhat wonky edges, a light shadow layer on top of it, where I have one single color that I use to either draw or erase in order to show the highlight layer beneath. A dark layer that I also either draw or erase in order to show the layer beneath. And then a deep dark shadow layer. And on top of all of this, I have a line art layer. Granted, it's a few layers, but I have just copied my reference layer and then used that to draw and erase each layer until I get something nice. Now I haven't spent time making these tiles look production ready. Our tiles should obviously look closer to this than this. But I think it's worth mentioning that even this base tile, in the context of a scene like this, looks nice. What I like about these tiles in general is actually the fact that they can help you to kind of make use of simple principles. I've covered this topic fairly often, but making sure that you have a simple core that looks good is often better than just adding stuff in hopes that it looks good. It rarely does. And as you can see with these tiles, they look okay, but there's no shading, no textures, just a harsh gradation from one color to another. If you manage to pick 2 nice colors for a tile like this, it can sort of carry the rest of your scene. You just need to make sure that the rest of the background kind of matches this. You don't have to do it exactly like I've done it here. I mean, we can even see that while I made these 2 tiles almost exactly the same, this tile is actually a bit different. For these 2 tiles, I fade it into one single color immediately. This follows the principle of removing attention from the interior of our tiles. But why do I, for the brick tile, still keep a pattern in interior? Well, my feeling when making this was that since the interior color is so dark, I could add some visual interest without it negatively affecting the look of it. And so I tried it and thought it looked good. But overall, I do advise against doing this. I think the more you do this type of stuff, the riskier it is that will look bad. It doesn't look bad here, but it does kind of look bad here. I don't like saying adding detail or contrast in the interior is explicitly wrong. As I said, Spelunky is a game that kind of makes it work. But most of the time when I see a bad tile set, it tends to have a messy interior. And the difference between when a detailed interior works and when it doesn't work can often be quite small. If we look at a game like Rogue Legacy 2, I would say that the tile map here kind of looks great, even though the interior of the tile map still looks fairly detailed. But if we look at Rogue Legacy 1, they still don't fade it out here, but I would argue that this doesn't look that good. This starts looking messy. It's arguably the same decision and kind of the same type of tile, but one works and the other one doesn't. Basically, if you're worse at art than what we can see in Rogue Legacy 1, my recommendation is to just skip the detailed interior and just fade it out. Making a detailed interior as a beginner artist is kind of like dropping out of college and claiming it's a smart decision, because after all, you're acting like Bill Gates. Bill Gates knew what he was doing. If you know what you're doing, go ahead. But if you don't know what you're doing, you will have an easier time going to college and avoiding details in the interior of the tileset. So one thing I haven't mentioned, which you can see in a game like Adventure Pals, is that we're viewing each tile sort of orthogonal to the surface, where we have grass on top and then dirt on the sides. Now if you look at my tiles, they're just one texture. It's all grass. It's grass on top, it's grass on the sides, it's rock on the top, it's rock on the sides. You can't do either option. Both work. I think the benefit of what I made here, and the benefit of what I make in islets, is that it's easier to place assets in the foreground, because now this fade to nothing actually blends well with foreground assets. It just looks like it's in the shadow. Whereas in this other scenario where you have a side view, now if you place assets in the foreground, you kind of get this weird mix. Like if we're seeing a cliff on the side, why does it have foreground assets? But in this scenario where it's just grass, foreground assets mix well. Either option works. I think for a beginner, mixing textures where you have grass on top and dirt inside might be more difficult, but it's not the end of the world. Now that we have a tileset like this, we can get a scene working kind of quickly. And here we're using very simple textures in the background, but it kind of works. We can see the same with this. Something very minimal, but it still kind of works. Now there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to add a few more assets to spice up your scene. This looks like a fairly intricate scene, but most of it is still just this one grass tile. So we have one tile that binds your scene together. It's effort to create that tile, but that tile also carries the rest of your scene. You obviously could add a foreground and an intricate background to this. We can see this in Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight uses tiles a lot because of how efficient it is. It just adds a lot of other environment assets on top of it. But I want to stress this again. Hollow Knight has a good look at its core, with nice looking tiles. It just adds stuff to make it better. But if your first tile looks like this, or this, rather than adding more stuff, I would just go back and fix that tile, fix that core. You don't want to build a house on a poor foundation. And more importantly, I just want to kind of push the fact that with a good tile set, we don't really have to add more. A game without a foreground looks fairly decent, and it's generally easier to deal with in terms of parallax and level design. Now with this said, we can also make the tile itself intricate, which I would claim is the case in islets. But I think as you can see in my example tiles, that something as artistically simple as this also kind of works. I mean, this is pretty much as complex as the art in Pizza Tower, but it doesn't look bad. At least I don't think so. You can make up your own mind. Now, I do rarely talk about tile maps, but not because I don't think they're useful. They're probably the best approach to making game art you can find. But I personally like keeping my sort of grey box scene separate from my art. And I also sometimes dislike the rigidness that a tile map forces you to use. So I personally only use a tile map for this purpose, where the playable area consists of a tile map, but my background and my foreground are usually free-floating sprites. And when I make scenes for my videos specifically, I don't use a tile map at all. As I said, they're annoying to make. But you should use them, and make sure to make them pretty. Not only because it's an efficient way to make your art, but also because if your art mostly consists of tile maps, you can make use of sprite batching, meaning fewer draw calls and better performance. There's a reason games use tile maps, and it's not just because it's fun to paint with tiles. What this means is that if your game basically only consists of a tile map and a few background assets, you barely have to worry about performance. Your tile map and your engine handles that for you. Now, I said I would get back to the idea of whether you should light up all edges or have the bottom of your asset be in the shadow. Should your asset look like this or this? The truth is that there isn't necessarily a right answer. I think Adam Cianus, who has a lot of videos on tiling, usually makes the bottom of his tiles be in shadow. And this does make sense if we imagine the sun coming from the top. Then it would be shining from above, and anything that is down here would be in the shadow. And we can see in the detailed scene I made recently that the bottom of the platform is in the shadow. And I kind of also explained the benefits of it. But there is a general reason I prefer lighting up all edges in a tile map like this. First of all, imagine that the light isn't coming from above. Imagine that instead of being outdoors, we're in a cave. Now the light source might as well be in the middle of our scene. In this scenario, any edge would be kind of lit, just as we can see here. What I want to say with this is basically, if you think too much about lighting in 2D, the logic of it is probably going to break down. The reason why I like lighting up all edges have nothing to do with the logic of it. The reason I like lighting up all edges is because it highlights my platforming area. Every single collider in a scene like this screams at us. It's incredibly noticeable. But if you make the bottom of your collider dark, now even though there is a collider here, it doesn't really demand our attention. So this is one reason. But an equally big reason I like lighting up the edges of my tileset is that I can consistently rotate any asset I want and have it perfectly match the rest of the scene. We can take a rock like this. It's light at the top, dark at the bottom. If I rotate it and place it here, it still matches the tiles. If I flip it upside down, it still matches the tiles. Basically, keeping your lighting consistent is, in my opinion, easier if you just kind of imagine that the center of your scene is the light source. Now, given that we're talking about lighting, you might be asking, why do I fade it exactly like this? Why is the highlight thin? Why do I make the entire fade across a single tile? Well, I personally think the highlight specifically tends to look nicer if it's small. But overall, there's no particular reason why you would have to do it this way. You can do it differently. You can have a slow fade or a quick fade. My only advice is that you keep it consistent across every biome. I do think it's somewhat easier fading across a single tile, because you don't have to make any more advanced rule set. But you can also approach it differently, and it isn't that difficult to deal with. Now, as for the reference itself, it's a 3x3 minimal auto tile texture. It uses a bit mask like this, and I also have a few extra layers like a grid layer to see where all my tiles are. It's made for a 128 by 128 tile size. You could obviously make it 256, 64, or 16. You don't have to download this reference. As I mentioned in my previous video, I don't generally like being too handholdy, but I did want to cover a simple principle you can learn to make very different tiles that still look quite consistently decent. And I personally prefer using a reference texture that I can just copy and change, rather than starting each auto tab from a blank canvas. This not only helps keep the aesthetics consistent, but it also helps me to line up my art. And you can obviously change some things. You can have line art and you can skip line art. But if you pick two nice colors and make a cute shape at the top and fade out the bottom, you'll generally have a nice tile set for your game. And a tile set that can kind of carry your game. None of the examples I provided are production ready. They're kind of messy, but hopefully you can use it to kind of analyze it if you want. I'd also say that generally you want to add a few extra tiles to sort of randomize your patterns. We can see with this tile that this simple dot here is so consistent that we start seeing the repetition. But this is easily fixable by adding a few extra tiles. Hopefully I haven't made a huge oversight for this video, but if I did, feel free to write it in the comments and I'll correct it. If you have a better approach for all of this, that would be nice to hear as well. And if you really want to get into the weeds, you can make quite complex rules for auto tiling. Rules that extend way beyond what I've showed here. But as I said, I think even a simple system like this can look fairly decent. Now, while the reference is free, I also released a video on my Patreon where I talk about making these tiles in more detail. So if you want to support my content, feel free to do so. Thanks for watching. Bye.